Alors, on va commencer. Bonsoir, bienvenue à cette séance de lundi numérique. Aujourd'hui, nous allons écouter l'intervention de Marian Dörk. Je vous rappelle que l'intervention d'aujourd'hui sera en anglais. L'intervention durera 1 heure. Il y aura une demi-heure après à suivre pour les questions. Marian Dörk est actuellement professeur à l'Université des sciences appliquées à Potsdam et co-dirige le groupe de recherche Urban Complexity Lab. Il travaille en collaboration avec de nombreux collaborateurs issus du design, de l'informatique et des sciences humaines en réalisant des projets qui s'intéressent particulièrement au potentiel des interfaces visuelles pour soutenir de nouvelles formes d'exploitation des données. So, I leave the floor to Marian, and please.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Je suis désolé, je ne parle pas le français. So this is going to be in English. Yeah, as I think you just said, I will start with the presentation and there will be plenty of time, hopefully, to have a discussion or questions afterwards. So I gave this presentation the title Watch and Wonder, Interactive Visualizations of Cultural Heritage Data. My goal with this presentation and maybe with our conversation is to kind of take these two perspectives on data visualizations, on visual interfaces. On the one hand, our perception, our viewing, our consumption maybe, what the screen offers. And on the other hand, the interactive capabilities, kind of the movements, the operations that we are carrying out with these instruments. I must say I'm honored also to speak at INHA. I don't have actually art historian background. I've been collaborating with some, but my background is actually computing and interface design. So and now that I'm talking about myself, I can say that we have a research group, the UC Lab, the Urban Complexity Lab, and we position ourselves with the research that we're doing in Potsdam at the intersection of design, computing, and the humanities, with a particular focus on data visualization. So we want to invent and make sense of data visualizations and better understand what they can do. We've been actually growing our team over the last years, and our backgrounds range from cultural studies to computer science, information science, interface design, and we've been carrying out all kinds of projects, not just within this group of people, but also with external collaborators. We have been involving students actually quite a bit. So some of the projects that we have done over the last years have actually been carried out by students. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm not just speaking about the work that I have done, but I actually want to say that this is all and always teamwork. The beginning of our research is actually often the acknowledgement of, and maybe to some degree also the appreciation of the availability of rich data. Data that has many connections, many data relations. We just talked about linked open data. But on the other hand, the richness also comes in size in terms of many entities, large databases. And with this richness comes maybe the opportunity of new forms of access. However, most of the information access systems are search-oriented. So the access is reduced, I would argue. We are often, or always really, for most systems, required to turn our interest or our curiosity into a search term. We have to translate something that hasn't really maybe formed into words, into a query, which is one problem. And then oftentimes the result set is returned in a linear set, either as a list or as a grid. You know these interfaces that decontextualize the items, whether they are artworks or books or whatever. Typically, they are only ranked according to some supposed relevance according to my query, and we don't really see how the individual results relate to one another. Mitchell-Whitelaw summarized this with this quote a few years ago. This is a truly generous mass, large, abundant, ample, yet in response to this abundance, collection interfaces wheel out miserly lists one page at a time. I sympathize then with this statement, and I think it's still true today that collection interfaces do not do justice to this abundance, this richness, and we need to do better. And this is basically what this talk is also about. I want to kind of open the spectrum of alternative interfaces to cultural collections. And this research on visualizing cultural collections starts with Mitchell-Whitelaw, who I just quoted, who coined the term generous interfaces. So generosity in contrast of stinginess. So instead of holding back the richness or the detail, generous interfaces expose these riches and they invite exploration. So I can really recommend, if any of you is working in the space of collection interfaces, digital systems, who are engaging with cultural heritage data, I think it's a useful and I think also inspiring term. And so has been our starting point for our research on visualizing cultural collections. Another starting point is Johanna Drucker's notion of humanities interfaces. So that we should. So there's let's say a plea for consideration of software as not just technological, supposedly neutral systems, but that these interfaces are cultural artifacts themselves, and we should actually apply a humanistic perspective when we, on the one hand, when we look at interfaces and use them, and also if you have, I don't know, the privilege or the duty to come up with these kinds of systems, whether they are databases or interfaces, that you also think along humanistic commitments and questions. And of course, there's much more related thinking and doing, and I try to cover a bit more, but I think these two scholars and these two notions, generous interfaces and humanities interfaces, has been really crucial and central for our research. And we would position this research at the intersection between interface design, digital humanities, and information retrieval. And at this intersection, one of the key questions for us has been, and it's also maybe the question for us here tonight, is how can we support the curious exploration of entire cultural collections, which may contain thousands of artifacts, while at the same time enabling the close and careful contemplation of individual artifacts and their features, their individual particular significance, and how they relate to another. So this is the kind of the challenge that we're going to return over and over again, the entirety of a large collection and the particularity of individual artifacts. Now, I've been already talking about data and collections. I think it's useful to characterize collections, cultural collections, as particular and I would say unique data sets. Now, I think whenever we talk about large data sets or application areas where computing or computational methods are being introduced, there's probably often some kind of argument for size and specificity, and it's really challenging. But I think here we really have something challenging, data in the sector of cultural heritage. And I would sketch out 4 properties. In some cases, we do deal with big data sets. So we deal with many artifacts and dimensions. And besides that, we're also dealing with often with a variety of artifacts. So we might be incorporating books, manuscripts, letters, physical objects, maybe even time-oriented artifacts like film or music. So in the space of cultural heritage, we are also dealing with a huge diversity. By definition, this stuff is historic. It comes with historic baggage. I can just say restitution and the colonial past of many objects that are held by cultural heritage institutions, but sometimes also more mundane objects carry their particular social, historical, political context with them that we somehow need to make sense of and acknowledge when we are providing digital access. And that's easier said than done, but it's, I think, a particular challenge that we should be aware of. And we are also oftentimes dealing with material objects, in the sense that they have a weight, a size, maybe even, let's say, a brittleness. I was just privileged to get a tour through the historic reading room in the National Library and some other rooms, newly restorated and well kept. But you know that books at some point, for example, but other artifacts become fragile. But with this materiality, what's also interesting is that it's not just the metadata or the content, but the actual visual material qualities that we might want to incorporate as well in the digital interfaces or the methods that we want to apply to them. Now, these four qualities could be treated as challenges. I call them opportunities for design. On the one hand, we are tasked to reveal the extent, the dimensions of collections. We want to acknowledge the diversity of facets and features, and find ways to display the relevant context or contexts in plural, because of course artifacts might have traveled from situation to situation, and something that we will get back to also multiple times here, this challenge of integrating details of particular artifacts and also arrive at abstractions or higher level perspectives in which maybe a larger amount of entities, artifacts can be summarized or visualized. Data visualization or information visualization is one perspective that we're taking here on cultural heritage data, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with data visualization, so I wanted to share kind of one of the agreed upon definitions that the community still uses by Card et al. From the 90s. So information visualization as the use of computer-supported interactive visual representations of abstract data to amplify cognition. So I'm going to unpack some key adjectives here. So first, we're talking about interactive visualizations in the sense that we can actually manipulate their visual manifestation, so we can actually use them to interact with them, manipulate them to see patterns and relationships. So we're not looking at still images, but these representations are dynamic. We are talking about visualizations that are, of course, utilizing our perceptual system. So they are, even if we're talking about artifacts and prototypes and systems and so forth, part of that constellation or of that apparatus is always the human. So what I want to show is never really about automatic use. It's always about actually enabling a user, a human, a viewer, a scholar to make sense of the data. And the primary mode of this is the visual sense. Other senses are feasible, of course, but I'm focusing today on the visual here. and it's representations of abstract data. So here the idea is that that the data does not have one necessary or inherent spatiality. So unlike maybe geodata, such as, I don't know, how the e-scooters are rolling around Paris, where we actually have already a spatial dimension, oftentimes data in the humanities or in the cultural heritage sector does not have that immediate spatial feature. So we have to actually come up with it, or we have to define how artifacts are going to be arranged on the display. And the last bit, amplifying cognition, which is just a mouthful for supporting thinking, I would say, helping viewers to make connections and gain insights. And yeah, so this is basically InfoVis, and I would say all the things that I'm going to show you over the next minutes are basically InfoVis information visualizations of cultural heritage data. But typically when we deal with information visualization, they look something like this. We see them maybe in the newspaper or in reports. They are fairly generic and a bit, I don't know, they lack maybe also the actual artifacts. They're kind of zoomed out perspectives. And I'm going to invoke a few cliches tonight. So I'm going to start with one. So I would say that many data visualizations are a bit like this perspective from the Eiffel Tower, where we get the sense that we see everything. We are given this synoptic view of Paris, and in a way, many data visualizations promise this overview, approaching big data challenges with big picture views to then find these global patterns of across space and time and in other data dimensions. But the issue with these kinds of representations is that they sometimes implicitly, sometimes a bit more overtly, they claim that we can see everything from nowhere, that we can actually grasp everything at once if we just find the right data visualization. This goes back to the title, Watch and Wonder. The overviews let us watch, but oftentimes they do not let us wander sufficiently from one view to the next. So I think if we are taking this cliche of walking around in Paris or appreciating the city, doesn't have to be Paris, but why not? We're here. Then I would say that actually being on street level and taking your feet or any other mobility device that you prefer, and actually moving around and taking in the smells, the sounds, maybe also the different characters of different districts is essential to actually make sense of the abundance or the richness that, in this case, a city can offer. Now back to data, back to cultural heritage. I think it's important to really think about the issue of movement, to actually approach complex data sets in potentially lateral movements along different situated views, meaning views that are anchored with artifacts or certain facets, so that we enable scholars, explorers, citizens to gradually make sense of data, not at once, but actually take time. And through this, the ambition, and we can discuss whether this ambition, whether we're closing in on this, but that we can actually support interpretive, critical analysis of data and also the artifacts that the data sets represent. One, and that's maybe my last cliche for tonight, one model for that, for these movements that we could draw upon is this cultural figure of the flaneur. So an urban dweller who feels at home in the streets in the middle of the 19th century, who is expressively or obviously privileged to do that, to have the time and to feel safe and to walk around, which has its own historical baggage, which I mentioned earlier, So it has been typically a male figure. There's another side to that as well. But this notion of the flaneur is someone who's actually wandering around the city, who doesn't have necessarily a clear goal in mind, but actually wants to let the urban environment and the urban sensation impress him and maybe also trigger his curiosity. Now there are different layers to the flaneur, and I'm not close to doing justice to the whole discourse around it, but I want to steal three aspects of this figure to construct a persona for interface and visualization design. So first, the flaneur is a curious explorer who is pursuing different paths through the city based on impressions that they have while they're moving around. The flaneur is also a critical spectator, so he doesn't just take it all in, but he also develops maybe a certain political commentary or a judgment about what's happening around him. And he's also portrayed as a creative mind. So there's also a certain artistic output, whether in poetry or painting. So he doesn't just let it sink in, but there's also a certain creative expression in response to this. Now, as I'm saying, I'm kind of stealing these three character traits to propose the information flaneur as maybe a modern, or I guess post-modern version of the flaneur who is roaming digital information spaces. So the information flaneur is equally curious, but in this case now he or she is pursuing diverse paths and data representations. They are critical, and they are reflecting about what the data actually contains, but maybe also the links or maybe even the artifacts or the data elements that are hidden. And there's also this creative moment where the information flaneur actually imagines alternative perspectives, maybe contributes new content, and basically doesn't let the data stay untouched, but actually adding to it. So this is, of course, a bit of a stretch. It doesn't yet maybe represent the way people use interfaces or visualizations, but it could be a model in the design and in the conception of interfaces and systems meant to support access to cultural heritage. One concept that is often mobilized when we talk about interface design is the concept of usability. Are the labels readable? Are the buttons big enough? Are people oriented? Can they find what they're looking for? Which is in a way, I don't want to say that this is not important. I think it's kind of at the very basic level of the kind of mechanisms of how interfaces function. But I think there should be another concept that we call explorability. So that's less about the interface mechanics and more about actually the relationship between information spaces, such as cultural collections, and information seekers, scholars, citizens, and explorability basically characterizes whether a collection does invite to that strolling, to this information flaneuring that I've alluded to. And there are three, but this is not a complete list, but three kind of sub-concepts which I find useful to consider when we're dealing with collection interfaces. The first is orientation. So can I, do I have a sense of direction, or can I develop a sense of orientation as I'm interacting with the collection so that I can maybe return to previous steps or venture out into territory that I haven't explored yet? So do systems actually support this kind of sensation that we rather know from the physical world? Can we come up with equivalents or counterparts in the digital space? The second concept is continuity. It's also something that we appreciate in the physical world as we are strolling along in the city, that not with each step that our environment doesn't change abruptly, but there's a certain continuous change. Maybe there's a column, there's a sign coming into view, or a street opens up, but it's all fairly gradual. And that continuous experience is something that we actually often lack in search systems. I might add a new query word, and it's an entire new result list. I don't really see immediately if something has been added or removed. So continuity is, I think, something that is often overlooked. And when it's there, we feel, okay, it's something, somehow the interface works better together. And I'm postponing the prototypes, but you will see this in a few minutes in action. And then serendipity, a concept that is really hard to design for. This idea of seemingly random, but often fortunate discoveries. So encountering important or inspiring insights without looking for them. But I think we can still keep this in mind when we conceive of visualizations or interfaces, that we allow for lateral connections between possibly related entities, so that people using the visualizations can actually make these discoveries. Now, to translate this into design, so I want to kind of reflect a bit on how we can actually design collection interfaces towards these aspirations, these aims. It's useful to consider, again, cultural collections as rich and interlinked data sets. And I would say that there are basically two main perspectives. On the one hand, we can consider, consume, or access a few items, artifacts, one by one, but we can only do this for a limited amount of artifacts, just because of our attention and maybe also time. So, but for these artifacts, we can actually look at them in high detail. And on the other hand, and that's maybe also the realm of data visualization, we can come up with abstract representations such as timelines, maps, network representations, in which we can actually represent thousands of artifacts. The individual artifacts disappear, but they are basically in there as they make a circle grow bigger because there are more of them, or an edge darker because there's more connectivity between certain entities. And so I think for this negotiation, for this question that I mentioned earlier, this challenge of exploring entire collections while accessing individual artifacts, this is the spectrum that we're dealing with. How can we actually harmonize or somehow provide access to these two, in these two modes? And before I share work that we have done in Potsdam, I want to give you a quick kind of not grand tour, like a petite tour of collection interface design. Here we have an interface designed at the University of Newcastle in the UK, where you can basically scroll along a seemingly random list of artifacts, and this is basically bringing together actually all kinds of databases, archaeology databases, historical databases, and as you're selecting individual artifacts, the system actually keeps track of your selections, that you can revisit things that you have encountered. It's an experimental interface. I don't know actually if it still is accessible. I think it's a nice, playful interface because it just works with scrolling. But what you might not see, it actually says on the bottom right, I think sometimes, the faster you scroll, the more random, the more different the artifacts are. If you scroll slowly and you have stopped scroll, or you're slowly scrolling around rocks or stones, you will get more stones. If you start to scroll very quickly, you will suddenly be in postcard land or stamps or statues or whatever. So it's a very, I don't know, a quirky kind of interface. It doesn't really provide, at least in this view, it doesn't really provide you with a high-level perspective. It just shows you a lot of artifacts, and you kind of have to go with this kind of arbitrariness of randomness. But your selections, they are probably meaningful. They might be triggered by your interest, and then the history that the prototype or this interface actually gives you is something that you can revisit. And I don't have this in this video, but the software actually then offers you a network diagram of all the entities that you have selected and shows you possible connections between them. So the only kind of overview or synopsis that is being offered is actually a reflection of your own selections, which is, I think, really cool. There has been another such, let's say, playful approach to providing access to cultural heritage. So this is here, these are basically archaeological finds in a Gracht in Amsterdam that has been basically dried up to make way for some kind of underground construction. And you're basically, so for the archaeologists in the room, I think there's at least one, this is, I think, gold, I don't know, but you're basically scrolling into history. So you're scrolling deeper and deeper, and my lay understanding of archaeology is depth means age, so the deeper you dig, the older it gets, typically, depending on how much intervention has happened, but more or less. So you see this actually, that the further you scroll, I think it now just stopped, the years on the top right actually reflect that. And so this is another kind of playful way of giving you the artifacts straight up. So there's not really much synopsis, not much overview, but this richness, this abundance is clearly there as you scroll along. And speaking of making similes between the city and the digital, what I really appreciate about this project is that they have actually exhibited, I don't know if all, but many of these artifacts along escalators in the metro stations in Amsterdam. So you could even physically scroll along these artifacts. So I think it's also I think all of them, they're worth checking out on your own time with a bit more care and time. Another project, actually a project from the New York Public Library, a few years old, is also involves scrolling, but here the artifacts are actually quite compressed, so you get a bit of a kind of sediment aesthetic. And in this case, they are ordered by time, and these are thousands, I think 187,000 digital items in the public domain that the NYPL owns. And the thumbnails are tiny, so you can't really see what it is. But you see through the kind of the average color that there are certain kind of segments, certain paper types or artifact types, and through hovering, then you can get more detail. And you can also change the ordering. So you can also arrange this by color or by categories or genres. So this is on the side. And there's even a further zoomed out perspective. It's a bit of a crazy interface if you think about it, but I think it's, once you have played with this, you ask yourself, why not? I mean, it's like, going to the reference desk in the library and ask for the red book, and here you might even spot it in such an interface. And so this is so library artifacts, and here we have a data visualization by Mitchell Whitelaw, who I mentioned earlier, that is actually representing the contents of the Australian National Archive, and I think I only have still, right? No, it's actually animated. And the squares basically, so there's actually a ratio being shown. On the one hand, so each square represents actually a set of archival items, and the square represents the ratio between number of art items and the physical size. So it basically is an abstract way, and I can't explain it in detail, but it's an abstract way of conveying that archival items do, of course, have physical sizes, and it's actually quite critical, especially when you're running out of space. So you can see see the archival headings for each of these items by hovering over them, and the color actually represents the time span. So some archival sets are more focused than others, and you don't see it on the side, but there's also a vertical ordering similar to the one that we have seen for the New York Public Library. Now, these are more or less linear orders here. This is, I have to kind of speed up a bit to get up to our own work. This is a network representation of the art market prepared by the Getty Institute. Here we have a project by Florian Kreutli, which is basically an interactive visualization that maps Benjamin Britten's compositions against the poetry that he has drawn from for his musical compositions. So on the top are basically the release or the date of creation of the pieces of the musical pieces, and on the bottom are the literary or poetic works. And you see kind of how far he reaches back or not in this juxtaposition. Here we have, unfortunately now, a prototype that isn't available anymore by the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. They have basically created a kind of network-oriented exploration interface where you can move from one painting to the next along different facets, including mood. So they actually added mood as a non-typical art historical facet. And as you stroll along this network, you can also go back again. Here we have another prototype that Mitchell Whitelaw has created with his team in Canberra, which is showing a print collection. So on the vertical, we basically have a timeline by decades, and each span is also separated by types of prints, and you can use this overview actually as a filter, so you can actually focus on certain years or decades and print types, and then also get actually detailed previews of these prints. And here is a project by Uta Henrys and colleagues, which is a multi-view visualization of an anthology of a poetry magazine. And what is interesting here, among several things, is that actually on the left side we have a hierarchy that is very idiosyncratic and goes back to the original collector of this anthology. So they have actually kind of respected some of the symbolism that some of the symbols that he used, and you can interact then with this collection through these different views. Now, this was the Petit tour. There's actually kind of a community of, I think, collection, interface design, visualization research in this space. Now, what I find particularly interesting here is that the different visual representations that you have seen in express mode over the last minutes are actually tightly coupled with the interactivity that is afforded. So while some arrangements invite you to scroll and maybe here and there click, others are a bit more analytical, and they require or encourage you to filter or to maybe move from element to element. And this bind between representation and interactivity is something that I think is very useful to, on the one hand, to make sense of the functionality of these prototypes, these systems, but I think they can also be generative to inform new design, new kinds of visualizations. And I brought with me 4 prototypes that I want to show you in action. I want to start with 2, and I want to briefly talk about how we're actually informing the design of such prototypes, and then, if time permits, maybe I can show you the other 2 as well. So I'm shifting gears a bit. So I want to start with the past visions visualization. Not this one. So this is a visualization of, or an interface that provides access to historic drawings by Frederick William IV, a Prussian king who is famous for his cultural, historical, literary interest. So he actually had a sketchbook, and what we see here is a subset of the sketches that he created over the years. And speaking of years, these sketches are all arranged along a timeline, which you can hardly see. There are actually years here. And so these sketches, these images, are arranged in a zoomable interface. So the further I zoom in, of course, more detail is being shown, both for the images as well as for the timeline. So these artifacts are not just shown as by themselves, but you can actually make sense of their creation by looking at, in this case, a biographical event in Frederick William's life. But there are also historic events like the July Revolution. This is kind of the horizontal logic. That's the years along which these images are laid out. There's another logic, which is basically the art historical tagging of these sketches, and they are actually tiny on the top. We are lucky to have I think a relatively high resolution here. I can, for example, select Potsdam. So Frederick William IV spent quite a lot of time in Potsdam. So I have now selected this keyword, and only those sketches that have been tagged with Potsdam remain above the timeline. Those that are not relevant according to this query or this filter are below. They're still there. They don't cease to exist. They still give you context. But you see now that, like here in 1820, confusingly, actually the historical item is urban planning Berlin, but there must have been also planning happening in Potsdam. So we can see, we can look at these drawings, and apart from the detail that is increased in the timeline, we also get high levels of detail for these scans. And now this zooming here that I'm happy to do just with a few hand strokes is actually quite a technical feat, moving from basically showing hundreds of little tiny thumbnails, similar to the thumbnails that we've seen with in the prototype by the New York Public Library. But here we can actually seamlessly zoom into really high resolution versions of these drawings. This is, I have to acknowledge, sometimes I forget, but this is a prototype that Christopher Peach has designed and engineered. He has been working on this for a few years. And this kind of smooth, gradual movement kind of encourage you to actually make these movements so that you actually move quickly from an overview to the very detailed close-up. So this is where basically what we see on the screen hopefully has an impact on how you move, how you operate on that, what is being shown. This goes back to the watch and wonder. Ideally, there's once you have been told or figured out that this is actually a zoomable interface, there's an affordance that tells you, hey, why don't you zoom in as much as you want and really look at these. Part of them, some of them are like really highly detailed and gorgeous. and basically encourage you to look at many of these sketches, even though maybe at first sight they might not look that interesting, but they are actually really interesting, I think. So actually I haven't shown this, but of course sometimes it's not sufficient to just marvel at the detail of these sketches. Maybe you actually want to find out what they are about. So there's actually very detailed description for all of them. And here I have to say we have been collaborating with the SPSG, the Foundation of Prussian Castles and Gardens. So they have had basically a parallel project where they were creating the art historical context, doing the interpretations, the descriptions, so that you can not just look at the artifacts, the scans, but also try to make sense of actually how they fit into the larger collection. Now, this is so in this project we noticed in the collaboration with art historians that this combination of timeline and tagging of art historical subjects has been very useful and relevant. But of course you could think of other layouts. So Chris played around with similarity-based layouts. So this is a Teasney plot. Teasney, basically a more recent technique for mapping any kind of entity, in this case these sketches, these drawings, based on their metadata similarity. And now some of these sketches are very close together, so they actually overlap. So there's also a way of actually gridifying them again, so that you basically have kind of an alternative grid. And to check whether this layout actually makes sense, we can now hover, for example, over keywords on the top. I'm hovering over Potsdam, and you see that there's a more or less contiguous space with all the Potsdam drawings. Now, this is, I think, a particularly noteworthy prototype because it has kind of exited prototype status. So we have actually applied this to other collections. We've played with Van Gogh paintings, with coins, with protest banners from the first big women's march in Boston after Trump took office. So this combination of some kind of linear order and the zooming and the tagging works for actually quite a lot of collections. Interestingly though, we thought we did something highly unique and specific that particularly works for this collection, but it ended up actually having a utility for other collections as well. I want to show you another project that has been done actually by a student team, of which Flavio Gortana was the main designer and developer. And this is basically a visualization of thousands of coins. And in this case, they're not ordered neatly in columns, but they are thrown on a big pile. And actually, an early joke for this prototype was actually that the story would say, "Welcome to the coin cabinet. The intern made a mistake and dropped all the coins. Please sort them up." And the system actually lets you sort them because apart from this pile, which is also zoomable, and actually each of these coins is actually also clickable and draggable. This is actually a dynamic image, as I mentioned earlier. This is in a way alive. You can dig in, but it lets you basically apply some magic based on the metadata that these coins are associated with. So here we collaborated with the Berliner Münzkabinett of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin. So this is basically the major coin collection in Berlin. And they really have their data in order, I have to say. And this was, I think, the gift of that, behind that, or let's say the privilege of that team or this project, that they could actually rely on really, at least as far as we can tell, not being numismaticians, that we can at least rely on quite a few intriguing facets, such as we can select material, so we can turn this single pile into multiple piles along material. And then the interface nudges me a bit into, takes me a bit along the hand to tell me what to do next. I can change the layout, for example, and compare different sizes. So I see there's mostly silver coins, bronze, and other materials with fewer elements. I can then filter along these. Maybe I want to focus on silver. And now I can select maybe a second metadata field. And I might be interested in the time component. So when these coins were minted. So now it's a bit tiny, but basically this legend here, these are centuries. So this is 600 BC until the present, basically, and even the future. Now we can take, we already see there's a bit of an ebb and flow of coins. Now the layout algorithm is kind of rubbing against that clean aesthetic that I mentioned a bit earlier. It actually has, there's a bit, this is not a precise instrument, Some coins lay just on the side, but there's still a general impression. You still see that around 600 AD, there are not so many coins in the collection, at least silver coins. Now, but you still get a general sense of kind of the temporal trends. And maybe I want to actually see the other materials again, so I can remove the silver filter, and I can see, okay, well, actually, the fewer coins in silver here actually were complemented by quite a bit more gold coins around the same time. So this is an experiment in kind of contrasting these very clean, often grid-based layouts that we encounter when we're dealing with coins. Whether you look at coins in digital interfaces or whether you go into the museum and you want to look at coins in person, they're often coming in grids. You always see, and of course, it's hard to actually turn them around. To be honest, this interface doesn't let you turn them around. This is one of the open features that the student team didn't get to, but they were, I must say, I don't have this actually in my slides, which I return to in a bit, but they were actually prototyping with the coins that they had at home. Of course, we all have a spare change bowl or something, and they started to think, okay, how could we work with coins? And in this project course, in which they were soon known as the coin team, they were really owning that, and they were saying, okay, how could we actually come up with something interesting with coins? And once you have not just one coin, but thousands, what is really cool is this idea of actually arranging them in different piles. And that's, of course, something that you would never really do if you would be a numismatician. It would be not really good for, you would not treat your artifacts well. Well, there are other layouts and other dimensions that I'm not going to go into yet, but this has also been a prototype that has then triggered quite a lot of interest among numismaticians, maybe not primarily as a research instrument, but as a way to convey the richness and the abundance that coin collections actually contain. And it has been also generally quite, there's been quite a lot of interest in this kind of playful way of engaging with cultural heritage. Now, I already alluded to the challenge of actually designing for or designing cultural heritage interfaces. And we don't do this alone. While we often are working in interdisciplinary teams, we're also collaborating with partners. And typically, of course, the partners that bring the data or that own the collections. So we run workshops to which we invite the experts, but always we also invite lay people. Apart from ourselves, we are rarely the experts about the collection, well, never really, but we often also invite people who have an interest but don't have the expertise. And that, we will see this in some of these images, but this gradient, or this basically creates a magnetism, I think, in these meetings, in these workshops, where interest and expertise meets, which encourages conversations. But what we do in these workshops, they always differ a bit in format, is we print out when it's possible, and with many cultural heritage collections it is possible, we print out basically copies in different sizes of the artifacts, and give lots of material and tools, glue, yarn, scissors, pens, pencils, and so forth. And we ask our collaborators to conceive perspectives and pathways into this collection. We don't ask them to design interfaces because typically they're not interface designers. They don't have the expertise for that. But they have the expertise about the collection and or an interest in it. So they are typically well equipped to actually come up with interesting, quirky collages. And and that's also what we often then see. We see quirky, interesting collages. But sometimes they're not just quirky, they're actually really loaded with knowledge. So here we have actually a collage that one of the curators of a porcelain collection. So she's actually arranging them by color, by form, by shape. So in the end, this collage actually was already like a semantically loaded visualization where the layout, so position X and Y, is already representing something. Here we worked with the National Library of Germany and the Exile Archive. This is a collage that was created during with the Berlinische Galerie of a Dada collection. And then after half an hour collaging, sometimes they do it in teams, sometimes they do it individually. We do a bit of kind of like tea leaf reading. We basically put the collages up on the wall and we do free interpretation of these collages. So not the people who created them will explain what they meant, but there's room for misinterpretation, which is very often another source for ideas, because we mistake some of the collages. There's little time, and sometimes you miss the labels, and once we do this interpretation process, we hit the audio recording button, and there's so much rich input basically coming up in these conversations about how the artifacts, whether they are coins or porcelain or photography, how this could be made available in the digital space. So I'm skipping over this because I'm running a bit out of time, but basically the co-design process is kind of the careful orchestration, not in a manipulative way, but more of a way of creating opportunities for encounters between the artifacts, different actors, such as experts or lay people, that engage together in activities. And they do this early on in workshops. We then draw on some of these ideas and turn them into sketches. When we get more feedback from our experts, we turn them into more detailed screen designs, and at the end, at some point, a prototype exists and can be tested and experimented with in more detail. I have 2 more prototypes and 2 more minutes. Okay, let's try this. So basically, I want to briefly show, and this will be very brief, the prototype of the Raoul Hausmann collection. So this is basically just a teaser. Play around with this. All the prototypes are online actually. So and the point of this project was to support lateral movements. So apart from this initial overview, you can actually now move from one artifact to the next based on similarities, based on shared metadata values. So I can move from one Dada postcard to the next. The later ones are above, the earlier ones are below. That's the Dada project. You have to check it out yourself. But the point here was, you're not just looking at these arrangements, you're invited to scroll along, or in this case, also click along from one artifact to the next. And then that's actually a work in progress, so I can just say this is not finished yet. But here, the idea, this is now glass negatives from the Hamburg Museum of Arts and Crafts of very early, basically their first photographic documentation, which is in the process of being digitized. But instead of showing an overview of thumbnails on which you cannot see anything, we see an overview of close-ups here. So the squares that are larger are basically tags. So these are flower ornaments these are tags that have been given out more often than others. And I can, so these are the negatives. I can go into basically the positive. So this is, curiously enough, an overview of close-ups, an overview of details. And you can use then these close-ups to see the various objects that have been tagged, in this case with flower ornaments. And the larger the square here, then this object has more of these. So there's actually, I want to click on this. This is going to be a book which has 220 of such tags. Let's see how the internet connection works here. So this is the prototype that is in progress. What should happen, just to give you some anticipation, that basically now these close-ups, these cutouts, so they all have been manually tagged on these glass negatives. They will now, about to happen, move into different places. And now there should also be an image in the background. This is this dark gray. Yes, there it is. So this is a very highly detailed book cover, and has been tagged also quite considerably. And so now you actually see the artifact. But when you go to the overview, you get basically the close-ups in this cloud. To wrap it up, I have one last slide. 1 minute. So I kind of try to capture this brute force run through collection visualization along watching and wondering. So I started in the prototypes that we have worked on with this idea of actually arranging a collection along time, texture, and themes, and allowing you to filter and zoom this visualization in the Past Visions project. Then we looked at the coins visualization, in which this semantic and material abundance allows you actually to arrange the coins in different logics. We've very briefly seen the situated perspectives on art collections, in this case a data collection, and which then lets you navigate between artifact-based views, and the work in progress, the close-up cloud, where the iconographic details let you actually go again, navigate you along these different views. This is all teamwork. I have to acknowledge and want to, and I'm really proud to acknowledge the many people that are listed here on the last slide. And I'm really curious about your questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Marian. Really, thank you for this amazing presentation. I was kidnapped and hypnotized by the prototypes. On passe en français. S'il y a des questions dans la salle, il y a quelqu'un qui souhaite poser des questions? Sinon, I have a geek question related to which technologies and which web frameworks are behind these prototypes, because there is a huge use of images, of quantities, a great mass of data. So which is the technologies behind some of these, for example, the coins prototype?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the coins project, as well as the Past Visions, they use Pixie.js, which is a library that uses WebGL and the canvas element. So this is the main JavaScript library that lets you then make use of the browser's graphical capabilities. I haven't talked about this much, and maybe that's already a given, but developing for the web today and for contemporary web browsers has changed over the last 10 years. So they are graphically and interactively well equipped. So what we often notice actually for these prototypes, they have been developed, they are typically still developed on a desktop or laptop machine, and then just for fun we test it on a smartphone or on a large touch device, and more often than less they are actually functional. I mean, then sometimes they need some tweaks, sometimes the click and the touch events and so forth, but it's quite amazing how far web technology travels and what it allows. Now, in terms of actually loading high-res imagery as you're zooming in, there is actually, there are some libraries that let you do that for individual artifacts, but what Chris has done for past visions for hundreds and also thousands of images is basically custom engineering, right? So and actually we have written a paper about it, and you can read it in more detail there, but there's basically stepwise loading where the first initial view where you see these hundreds of tiny thumbnails, these are not hundreds or thousands of web requests hitting the same server. So basically the first image is not one image, but it's basically loaded in one batch. So yeah, let's leave it there. And if you zoom more in, additional imagery is loaded on demand. And there's always more detail loaded, a bit more in advance than so that you can zoom in and that is not immediately getting pixelated, right? So there's a bit of
course.
But I'm happy that we had a good connection here so that things went smoothly. But once you do it on a slower connection, you see the loading indicator. Yeah.
Donc, des questions? J'arrive.
Thank you very much, first of all. How do you deal with the new discoveries? Like, how do you integrate the new data? Because is it you who does it, or the conservator or the team of the museums?
Well, to be honest, neither, because everything that I've shown you, they are all research prototypes. So typically, we do not go back to them. So they are often frozen in time. In this case, so for the Past Visions project, we actually continued working on it, and I want to show you actually a newer version. Let's see if I get so this Past Visions project has turned into kind of a reusable software called the Vicos Viewer, and so here we now have, so the earlier version were like 1,500 drawings by Frederick William IV, and this now has almost 7,000. So now we can see a bit the difference, and so this skyline that wasn't meant to be a skyline is much denser. So this is the old version, and this is basically the new. So it's really each thumbnail has become like a pixel or something, right? But yeah, curiously enough, it still works quite smoothly. But yeah, how do we update the data? We typically don't. However, so for us, for our experiment, that's actually I'm hearing another question, which is basically how do we deal with sort of data management and what kind of data would we work with? So what we try to avoid is actually having to deal with intricate content management systems, and rather ask for clean exports like a CSV or a JSON file. So to basically get quickly into prototyping and experimentation and not having to, we still do that, but we still of course work with more or less idiosyncratic formats and so forth. But in this case, we have kind of set a fairly basic structure. It's a CSV file that contains the main columns that you need to run, have the sufficiently data for this, and you just add rows. And now what we don't do really is what this interface doesn't do, and none of these prototypes really do well, is indicating to the viewer, hello, we've got new drawings that have been scanned and enriched. Look here. This is not there. So you have to look closely. Yeah.
Merci. Des autres questions?
Yes, thank you. How much time does it take from the collages to the prototype?
That really depends on kind of the technical proficiency of the team, the time of the partners, the quality of the data, whether there needs to, I sometimes call this data massaging. Sometimes the data needs to kind of be in a good shape so that you can actually work with it. So it can be between 3 months or, I don't know, half a year. Yeah, that's maybe roughly the timeline.
Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I was wondering, I guess I got the answer, but are you interested in feedbacks, or are they displayed like in the museum on the screen, or are you collecting metrics on the way people are actually using these interfaces, or are you not interested in those because this is just about creating a working prototype?
Generally, we are interested in feedback for sure, and also how these prototypes are being used. For specific projects, we actually we instrument the prototypes. So for example, for the Past Vision project, we had an instrumented version running online for a few weeks, and then we analyzed the level of engagement, the length of, like how long people actually interacted with it, whether they zoomed in quite close, whether they had multiple filters. So we actually have done some custom logging or analytics. We now that, so some of these prototypes, they live online, but we do not continuously monitor them. But of course, our partners are also interested. So when for example, the last project I've shown, the close-up cloud with the glass negatives, this will be, and that's actually not so often the case, but this will be a visualization that will be shown as part of an exhibition. So if you find yourself in Hamburg on the 5th of December, the MKG, the museum, will actually have this visualization as a media station, and we are now actually talking about how instrumentation, how logging could happen. We don't do it across the board. It kind of depends on schedules and so forth. But yeah, we noticed, what I can say though, I'm hearing another question, and if you do, what's your insight? We noticed that actually some of these visualizations, they need proper hand-holding. They need proper guides so that lay people see what they can do with these interfaces. Because even though maybe some of us are familiar with zooming or with filtering and so forth, I think especially when people encounter them on the web, people might not know what they're expected to do now. So for example, in the coins visualization, that you have these things popping up and say, hey, if you click here, you can select a criterion to arrange things and so forth. This that has been one insight, that visualizations actually are seldom self-explanatory, which is an important lesson for someone who's, promoting the power of visualization. You need text or even spoken language. We haven't done that yet, but you could also think of an audio guide walking you through. So these are quite sophisticated instruments, and I think it's asking too much from lay people, if it's lay people using them, to know what you can do with them, right? And apart from the functional aspect of understanding how to use it, of course, there's also the content or art historic aspect. Maybe you actually want to guide people to interesting patterns, right? Maybe you want to tell them a bit of a story, and also that visualizations do not tell themselves. They don't. So that's something that we noticed, that we're creating these visualizations, these prototypes, out of a visualization research group, and of course we're living in a bubble in terms of we're relatively savvy probably using them, and so this is it needs this this assistance or this introduction. Yeah.
D'autres questions? Nous avons encore le temps pour une couple de questions. Ok, c'est Pierre.
Comme il reste du temps et qu'il n'y a plus de questions, est-ce qu'on peut revenir sur la démonstration des pièces coins?
Pierre asks if we can go back to the prototype of coins and see again to see more filter if you want. So we have some time.
Sure.
Et si entre-temps vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à lever la main.
Yeah, so and I think another interesting kind of perspective that you can take here is actually the region, right? So where these coins are coming from, or I think apart from region, also basically countries, in the sense which countries there are now. And this again is just basically a bunch of piles. You can also arrange them in a linear kind of list, but you can, as I've done before with the material, we can also now juxtapose this with time again, and so we see that the earliest coins in the Münzkabinett are from Turkey and Greece. And there's actually also another layout that I think doesn't actually require any filters, which is basically, no, it does require a filter, excuse me, which is basically a grid, the grid that I've been mocking so much earlier. But by creating this grid now, something sticks out, which are actually these dolphins here. So there are actually some coins which are not circular. So this becomes visible through this repetition. And of course you see kind of equally as in the case of the other systems I've shown earlier, through the repetition you also see patterns. I don't know if these are kind of anchors or arrow and bow, but they are kind of similar shapes on these coins. And there's one layout which I haven't actually shown, which is actually asks you to select an individual coin, and by selecting it, we basically arrange all the other coins around it based on similarity. So now this coin from Turkey, from contemporary Turkey, is similar to these based on material, time, weight, and so forth. So this now, I think, supports this idea again, watch and wonder. I can now move from one coin to the next and basically take also a closer look. Now in this interface, we don't actually have high-res displays, so I have to go into the conventional digital library or this interface of the Münzkabinett to actually see more details. So it also affords this kind of navigational view from one coin to the next.
The values of the field in each are dynamics, or so for example Greece, if I click on Greece,
It becomes a filter.
Filter.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So so we don't have quantitative filters in here, only basically categorical. So I can say, give me the Greek coins.
Apply the filter on Greek.
Yeah. So and we can actually combine them. So if you want the gold coins from Greece, it's maybe a politically loaded filter. Yeah, and I can arrange them along a timeline, which is not really. I have the grid, that's why. But you can see that there are certain clusters. And again, similar to the Past Visions project, the other coins do not disappear; they just move basically out of sight. And once you remove a filter again, maybe I want to look at all the gold coins. They basically come back into view. And you have kind of this kind of consistency of visibility. To be honest, what else? Well, we can actually also juxtapose. That's actually nice. We can juxtapose some of the material qualities. So I can choose diameter and weight, which should have some kind of relationship, of course. So as you can tell, and maybe I look at all the coins. So now we have a scatter plot of all the coins. And here you see a bit of an issue of this layout because there's lots of overplotting. So considering these are thousands of coins, that means they are piling quite tall here. So it doesn't really support a logarithmic view, but this would probably help now. But we see that somehow the larger the diameter, the heavier the coins are for some reason.
Thank you again, Marian. Je pense qu'on peut clôturer la séance. Merci encore à Marian Dörk pour cette intervention. Et j'en profite pour rappeler que la séance sera diffusée sur notre chaîne YouTube, la chaîne YouTube de l'INHA. Et je vous donne rendez-vous au mois prochain pour la 3e séance de cette année. Nous accueillerons Julia Roger du pôle documents numériques Unicamp, Arnaud Darret et Clémentine Berthelot du musée de la tapisserie de Bayeux pour une intervention intitulée « Un système d'information documentaire spatialisé pour la valorisation scientifique de la tapisserie de Bayeux ». Merci et au revoir à la prochaine séance.
Merci.